Good evening, Falcon class. I saw that Mrs. Harley read you chapter 4 yesterday. Sorry it's late, but we're going to read chapter 5 today. I hope you've all enjoyed some sunshine. Ready? So it's Kensuke is chapter 5. He was diminutive, no taller than me, and as an old man I had ever seen. He wore nothing but a pair of tattered breeches bunched at the waist, and there was a large knife in his belt. He was thin, too, in places under his arms, round his neck, and in his midriff. His copper-brown skin lay in folds about him, almost as if he'd shrunk inside it. What little hair he had on his head and his chin was long and wispy and white. I could see him at once that he was very agitated, his chin trembling, his heavily hooded eyes accusing and angry. "Demeter! Demeter!" he screeched at me. This whole body was shaking with fury. I backed away as he scuttled up at the beach towards me, gesticulating wildly with his stick and haranguing me as he came. Ancient and skeletal he may have been, but he was moving fast, running almost. "Demeter! Demeter!" I had no idea what he was saying. It sounded Chinese or Japanese, maybe. I was about to turn and run when Stella, who strangely had not barked at him at all, suddenly left my side and went bounding off towards him. Her hackles were not up. She was not growling. To my astonishment, she greeted him like a long-lost friend. He was no more than a few feet away from me when he stopped. We stood looking at each other in silence for a few moments. He was leaning on his stick, trying to catch his breath. American? Ethiopian? British? Yes, I said, relieved to have understood something at last. English, I'm English. It seemed a struggle for him to get the words out. No good. Fire no good. You understand? No fire. He seemed less angry now. But my mother, my father, they might see it. They see the smoke. It was plain he didn't understand me, so I pointed out to sea, by way of explanation. Out there, they're out there. They'll see the fire, they'll come and fetch me. Instantly he became aggressive again. Demeter! He shrieked, waving his stick at me. No fire! I thought for a moment he was going to attack me, but he did not. Instead, he began to rake through the sand at my feet with his stick. He was drawing the outline of something, jabbering incomprehensibly, all the time. It looked like some kind of fruit at first, a nut perhaps, a peanut. Now I understood. It was a map of the island. When it was done, he fell on his knees beside it and pulled up mounds of sand, one at each end, the two hills. Then, very deliberately, he etched out a straight line, top to bottom, cutting the smaller end of the island off from the larger one. You, boy, you here, he said, pointing back towards my cave at the end of the beach. You! And he stabbed his finger in the mound of sand that was my hill. Then across the whole sand map he began to write something. The letters was not letters at all, but symbols. All kinds of ticks and pyramids and crosses and horizontal lines and slashes and squiggles, as he wrote it all backwards, in columns from right to left. He sat back on his haunches and chapped his chest. Kensuke, Kensuke, my island. And he brought his hand down sharply like a chopper, separating the island in two. Kensuke, here, you boy, here. I was already in no doubt about to ask about what he meant. Suddenly, he was on his feet again, waving me away with his stick. Go, boy, no fire. Demeter, no fire. You understand? I did not argue, but walked away at once. When, after a while, I dared to look back, he was kneeling down beside me, what was left of my fire, and scooping more sand onto it. Stella had stayed with him. I whistled for her. She came, but not at once. I could see she was very reluctant to leave him. She was behaving very oddly. Stella Artois had never been kind to strangers. Never. I felt disappointed in her, a bit betrayed even. When I looked back, the fire was not smoking at all. It had been completely smothered, and the old man was nowhere to be seen. For the rest of that day, I stayed in my cave. For some reason, I felt safe there. I suppose I had already begun to think of it as home. I had no other. I felt as an orphan must feel, abandoned and alone in the world. I was frightened, I was angry, and I was completely bewildered. I sat there trying to gather my thoughts. So as far as I could tell, though I couldn't be sure of it, there were only 2 of us on this island, the old man and me. In which case, it stood to be the reason that he could only left me fish and the bananas in the water. Surely that could have been an act of kindness, a sign of friendship, of welcome. And yet, now this man had banished me from one end of the island as if I was a leper and made it quite clear that he never wanted to meet us again. And all because I lit a fire? None of it made any sense at all. Unless he was out of his head and completely mad. I took a long, hard look at my situation. I was marooned on an island in the middle of nowhere, very probably with a madman for company, and a bunch of howling monkeys, at least one orangutan amongst them. And God knows what else might be hidden in the forest, and millions of mosquitoes that would eat me alive every night. I knew only one thing. I had to get away. But how? How was I ever going to get off this island unless I could attract the attention of some passing ship? I could be here for the rest of my life. The thought didn't bear dwelling on. I wondered how long the old man had been on the island, and what might have brought him here in the first place. Who was he? And who was he anyway to tell me what I could and couldn't do? And why had he put out my fire? I curled up in my cave, closed my eyes, and just wished myself back home, or back on the Peggy Sue with my mother and father. Such wonderful dreaming almost lulled me to sleep, but the mosquitoes and the howling from the forest soon dragged me back to the consciousness to face once again the appealing implications of my wretched predicament. It came to me suddenly that I had seen the old man's face from somewhere before. I had no idea how that could be. I lay there pondering this. I felt the piece of my glass in my pocket pressing into my hip. My spirits were suddenly lifted again. I still had my fire glass. I would build my fire again, but this time somewhere he wouldn't discover it. I would wait for a ship to come, and then I would survive. The old man had survived in this place. If he could, I could. And I could do it alone too. I didn't need him. I felt hungry and thirsty too. Tomorrow I would go into the forest and find food for myself. I would find water. Somehow or another I would catch fish too. I was good at fishing. If I could catch them in the reservoir back home and off the Peggy Sue, then I could catch them here. I spent the night cursing the hordes of whirring insects that were homing in on me, and the chattering forest that would not be silent and that would not let me be. I kept seeing the reservoir in my mind's eyes, and my mother laughing in her skipper's cap. I felt tears coming and tried not to think of her. I thought of the old man. I was still trying to remember what he had said his name was when I fell asleep. I awoke and knew at once that he had been. It was as if I had dreamed it. Stella seemed to have dreamed the same dream, for at once she was bounding up on the rocks above the cave. She found what she clearly expected to be there, her bowl of water full again, and there, too, high on the shelf of the rock beyond her, was the same upturned tin, my water bowl beside it, just as it had been the morning before. I knew it would be full, and I knew as I lifted it aside that the tin would be there again. As I sat there cross-legged on the rocks, chewing ravenously on my fish and throwing pieces down for Stella to catch, I realised exactly what he was meant to imply by this. We were not friends. We would not be friends. He would keep me alive, keep Stella alive, but so long as I lived by his rules. I had to keep to my end of the island, and I must never light fires. It was all quite clear. With any real hope of immediate rescue diminishing day by day, I became more and more resigned. I knew I had no choice but to accept his terms and go along with his regime for the moment. He had now mapped out a frontier, a boundary line in the sand from the forest down to the sea on both sides of the islands, and he renewed it frequently, as often it needed to be. Stella strayed over it, of course. I couldn't prevent her, but I did not. It wasn't worth it. In spite of the animosity I had seen in his eyes and that huge knife in his belt, I didn't really think he would ever hurt me, but I was frightened by him, and because of that, and because I had too much to lose, I did not want to confront him. After all, he was providing for us every day with all the food and water we needed. I was beginning to find some edible fruit for myself. In particular, a prickly shelled fruit, rambutan, I later discovered. It was delicious, but but I could never find enough, and besides, Stella would not eat it. I find the occasional coconut still intact, but often both the milk and flesh was foul. Once or twice I even tried climbing for them, but they were always too high, and I very soon gave up. I tried fishing in the shallows, fashioning a crude spear, a long stick I had sharpened on a rock, but I was always too slow in my strike. There was often plenty of fish, but they were too small and too fast. So, like it or not, we still very much needed the daily ration of fish and fruit that old man was bringing us. I had searched my end of the island for fresh water, but could find none. I thought often about trespassing into the old man's part of the forest to look for it, but I dared not. Mum, can you just turn it down, please? Mum, can you turn it down? Sorry, guys. Start again. I thought often of trespassing into the old man's part of the forest to look for it, but I dared not. For the most part, I kept close to the forest tracks. It wasn't only the old man's law nor the howling of the monkeys, which I came to understand as a warning, that prevented me from venturing into his side of the island, but it was the orangutan too. He had seemed placid enough, but I had no idea he or his friends might react if they found me in his territory. I kept wondering to what other creatures might lurk unseen, waiting to ambush me in the dark damp of the forest. If the constant jungle talk was anything to go by, the place was crawling with all sorts of dreadful creatures. Just the thought of the orangutan and the terrors of the unknown in the forest were quite enough to deter me, even enough to stifle both my curiosity and courage. So I kept largely to the beach, my cave, and the forest track up to my hilltop. From high on my hill, I did catch distant glimpses of the old man. Often in the morning, I would see him spearfishing in the shallows, sometimes alone, but often accompanied by a group of orangutans, who sat on the beach and watched him. 14 or 15 of them I counted once. Occasionally, he would be carrying one of the young ones on his back. When he moved amongst them, it almost seemed as if he was one of them. Time and time again, I tried to stay awake until the old man came with the food at night, but I never managed it. I never even heard him, not once. But every morning the water would be there, the fish too. It often tasted smoky, which I liked better. The fruit would not always be the same. Much of it was strangely scented, and not all to my liking. I ate it anyway. Besides bananas and coconut and berries, he would leave me breadfruit or jackfruit. At the time, of course, I had no idea what they were. I ate everything, but not so greedily now. I would try and save some of the fruit for an evening meal, but I could never bring myself to save the red bananas. They were just too delicious not to eat all at once. My reoccurring nightmare was the mosquitoes at night. From dusk onwards, they searched me out, buzzed in on me and ate me alive. There was no hiding place. My nights were one long torture. And in the morning I would scratch myself, particularly on my legs, and now I had swelled up and they became red sores. I found relief from only dunking myself often in the cool of the sea. I tried sleeping in another cave, deeper and darker, but it smelt dreadful. Once I had discovered it was full of bats, I left at once. Wherever I slept, the mosquitoes found me soon enough. It got so loud that I dreaded the coming of every night. I cried aloud in my misery, and I swiped and I flailed at them. I longed for mornings, for the call of the sea and for the call of the wind on my hilltop. Here I would spend the greater part of my day, sitting on my very summit, looking out to sea, sometimes even praying, too, for the sight of a ship. I would close my eyes tight shut and pray for as long as I could, and then open them again. Every time I did it, I really believed that there was a chance my prayers would be answered. That this time I would open my eyes and see the Peggy Sue sailing back to rescue me. But always the great wide ocean was empty, the line of the horizon quite uninterrupted. I was always disappointed, of course, often dejected, but not yet completely despondent, not in those early weeks. I had severe problems too with sunburn. I had learned rather late that I should keep all my clothes on all the time. I made myself a hat to keep my sun off my face and my neck. It was very broad and Chinese looking, made of palm trees. The edges folded into one another. I was quite pleased with my handiwork. Sunburn, I discovered, was a discomfort I could help to prevent. and that the seawater could soothe. At noon, I would go to the hill on the shelter of my cave from the burning heat of the afternoon sun, and then afterwards I would go swimming. This was the moment Stella longed for each day. I spent long hours throwing a stick for her. She loved it, and to be truthful, so did I. It was the highlight of our day. We'd only stop when the darkness had come down. It always came down surprisingly quickly too, and drove us back once more to our cave, back to my nightly battle with blood-sucking tormentors. One day, after yet another fruitless morning of watching on the hill, Stella and I were coming out of the forest when I spotted something lying on the sand just outside our cave. At a distance, it looked like a piece of driftwood. Stella got there before me and was stiffing over it overexcitedly. I could see now what it was for. It was not driftwood at all, but a roll of rush matting. I unrolled it. Inside and neatly folded was a white sheet. He knew. The old man knew my miseries, my discomforts, my every need. He must have been watching me all the time, and closely too. He must have seen me scratching myself, seen the red weasels on my leg, on my arms, seen me sitting in the sea every morning to soothe away my sores. Surely this must mean that he had forgiven me now for lighting the fire. I carried the matting inside the cave, unrolled it, wound myself in the sheet, and just lay there giggling with joy. I could pull the sheet right up over my face. Tonight there would be no way for those cursed mosquitoes. Tonight they would go hungry. I went racing along the beach to the boundary line where I stopped, cut my hands to my mouth and shouted, thank you for my bed, thank you. I didn't really expect an answer, and none came. I hoped that he might come himself, but he didn't. So I wrote a thanks in the sand right by the boundary line and signed it. I wanted to see him again, to talk to him, to hear his human voice. Stella Artois had been a wonderful companion for me. Good for confiding in, good for a cuddle, good for a game, but I so missed human company. My mother, my father, lost to me now, perhaps forever. I longed to see the old man, to speak to him, even if he was a bit mad, even if I couldn't understand much of what he was saying. That night I was determined to stay awake for him, but comfortable in my new matting bed, protected and swallowed in my sheet, I went to sleep quickly and never woke once. The next morning, after a breakfast of fish and jackfruit and coconut, Stella and I made our way back up to the top of my hill, or watch hill as I now called it. The other one I had named his hill. I was repairing my Chinese hat, replacing some of the palm leaves. It never seemed to hold together for very long. When I looked up and saw a ship on the horizon, there was no mistake. It was the long, bulky profile of a super tanker. Oh, again, they leave us on cliffhangers every time. I wonder who is on that tanker and how is he feeling now that he's seen humans. Do you think he wants to go and find them? Right, well, you're going to have to wait until Tuesday to see, guys, because it's Good Friday tomorrow, it's then the weekend, and then it's Easter Monday. I hope you have a lovely weekend. I hope you try to enjoy the sunshine, and I hope you eat lots and lots of chocolate. See you soon, guys. Bye.